It was the first week of November 2014 when I drove out to a hunting cabin in eastern Oregon. I had just turned 32 and was trying to pull myself together after a rough year. My cousin Adam had offered to let me use his place while he and his family were down in Sacramento. He knew I'd been going through a stretch of personal things I didn't really want to talk about. My girlfriend had left earlier that spring, and my job at the warehouse was wearing me down in every way. I needed some space and some time, and I thought a few days alone in the woods would be the best way to reset. The quiet always helped. The cabin wasn't big. One room with a small kitchenette, an old iron stove in the corner, and a cot by the only window that overlooked the tree line to the west. It sat about 15 miles off any paved road, with no cell signal for miles. Adam had it set up with a generator and a rain barrel for water collection, but there was no plumbing and barely any insulation. Just enough to keep warm if you kept the fire going. It was the kind of place where you woke up with your breath hanging in the air during the colder months. I got there just after noon. The drive took longer than I remembered. Twisting dirt roads, some of them washed out a bit from early rain. I parked the truck beside the cabin and took my gear inside. I had 2 coolers of food, my sleeping bag, my rifle, and a few other basics. I also brought a trail cam I had picked up cheap from a guy in La Grande. I wasn't really expecting to see anything big this trip. I just wanted to sit in the woods for a while and breathe again. The first day was uneventful. I set up the camera by an old deer path about 100 yards from the cabin. There were a few faint prints in the dirt and signs of scraping on the trees. Might have been elk or even bear. The area hadn't seen much pressure from other hunters, so the wildlife moved fairly freely. I didn't bring bait, just left the camera to pick up whatever passed by naturally. That night, I lit a small fire in the stove, made some canned chili, and laid back on the cot with a flashlight and a beat-up paperback I brought along. The silence out there was thick, the kind that wraps around you and makes your own breathing sound loud. I slept okay the first night. Not great. I kept waking up to the occasional snapping twig or the creaking of the old wood cabin, but I told myself it was just the wind or animals moving through. I'd been in cabins before. You learn not to jump at every sound. The next morning, I hiked out toward the northern ridge, maybe half a mile, and found a small clearing where I waited for a while. I had my rifle with me, but I didn't fire a shot, just sat still and watched the woods. Around noon, I headed back, ate, checked the trail cam, and saw nothing but some squirrels and a blurry raccoon. No big deal. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. But that night, things started to feel different. Around 2 in the morning, I was lying on the cot with my sleeping bag zipped up tight. I hadn't fallen asleep yet. Something just kept me wired. I stared out the window at the dark tree line and listened. I couldn't see much, but I could hear something. Faint crunching. Not steady. A few steps, then silence. Then again. Slow. Deliberate. Not like a deer, not like a bear. And not close enough to be a threat yet, but enough to wake the hairs on my neck. I sat up slowly and looked out the window, keeping the flashlight off. There was nothing visible in the dark, but I knew something was moving just beyond the light's edge. I waited. After a while, the steps faded, and I finally drifted off sometime near dawn. When I woke up, the sun was already climbing, and the ground outside was wet from dew. I stepped out and circled the cabin, looking for signs of tracks. That's when I found the marks in the dirt on the east side. Shallow boot prints, not mine. Smaller, like someone wearing a size 9 or 10. I wear 11s. The prints were old enough that they weren't sharp, but they weren't mine. And they weren't from Adam either. He wore 12s, and his boots had deep treads. These were smoother, almost like casual hiking boots. I felt the kind of cold that doesn't come from the wind. I told myself it could have been from days ago. Maybe someone hiked through the area. But I knew the signs. I grew up hunting and tracking. Those prints weren't that old. Maybe a day, 2 max. I kept my rifle close after that. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin, checking the trees for signs of trail markers or fresh blazes, but nothing suggested someone had passed through recently. No wrappers, no fresh cuts, no trash. Just those boot prints and the soft crunch of something that night. That evening, I didn't start a fire in the stove. I wanted the inside of the cabin to be quiet. I ate a cold sandwich and stayed dressed in my boots and coat, sitting on the edge of the cot with the rifle propped against my leg. I didn't like the idea of scaring myself, but I liked the idea of not being ready even less. Around midnight, I started hearing it again, this time closer. The steps were soft but definite, moving along the side of the cabin, then pausing, then continuing. It was circling. Whoever it was wasn't trying to break in or talk, just slowly walking the perimeter. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard something faint but sharp, metal lightly tapping wood. It might have been a zipper pull brushing the siding, or maybe something else. I didn't move. I just stayed frozen on the cot. Eventually, the sounds drifted off again, but I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I walked a wider perimeter. That's when I found the second set of prints, different treads, bigger than the first. These had deeper lugs, more like heavy boots. Now there were at least 2 people, or 2 sets of tracks. One moving light and closed, the other heavier, wider. Neither set was mine. I started packing that morning. Something was wrong. I had 3 days left on my plan, but I didn't like how things were adding up. I figured I'd check the trail cam one last time and then start loading the truck. When I got out there to retrieve it, I stopped cold. The camera was gone. Not knocked over, not broken, just gone. The strap that had held it to the tree was lying on the ground like someone had carefully unbuckled it. And that part scared me more than anything. A bear or coyote might break it. Someone messing around might throw it. But unstrapping it carefully? That was a message. I spun around and scanned the woods, but I couldn't see anything through the pines. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, and I tightened my grip on it as I walked backward toward the cabin. I kept my eyes on the trees the whole way back. I didn't even go inside. I grabbed the cooler, my rifle case, and shoved everything into the back of the truck. I had already locked the cabin, but something in me didn't even want to step through the door again. Then I noticed something new, wedged under the front left tire of the truck. A stick about a foot long, thin but clearly placed there. Not broken naturally, set at an angle like it had been jammed under the tire intentionally. I knew what it meant. They were watching. They knew I was going to leave, and they wanted me to know they knew. I didn't look around again. I just got in the truck and started it up. The stick snapped under the weight of the tire as I backed out. I drove fast, probably too fast for those dirt roads, but I didn't stop until I was past the tree line and back on asphalt. When I finally pulled into a gas station outside of Pendleton, I realized my hands were still shaking. I sat there with the engine running, just breathing, trying to think. I didn't go to the police. What would I say? That someone walked around my cabin and stole a camera? That someone left a stick under my tire? I didn't want to sound crazy, but I knew it had been real. Back home, I told Adam everything. He believed me, but said he hadn't had anything like that happen in the years he'd owned the place. Said maybe someone was squatting nearby or passing through. Maybe someone didn't want others hunting in the area. It was public land beyond the cabin property line, and not everyone likes company. He ended up putting up a new camera system, wired this time. I haven't been back since. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't packed up that morning. If I had stayed one more night. If I had confronted them. I still don't know what they wanted, or why they didn't just walk away after that first night. But I think about the steps circling the cabin. I think about the missing camera and the stick under my tire. And I know this much for sure. Whoever was out there didn't want to be seen. And they didn't want me there either. I've gone hunting since then, but never alone, and never that far out. That cabin still sits there, quiet under the pines. But I'm not going back. Not ever. It was late October of 2017 when I finally decided to head up to that patch of land I bought 2 years earlier. I was 31 back then. My name's Drew. I had been saving up for a while, working night shifts as a maintenance guy at a warehouse in southern Idaho. I wanted a place to escape on weekends, something far from people, quiet and still. I found this 6-acre property just west of Thompson Falls, Montana. It was wooded, hilly, and cheap. It didn't have anything on it. No driveway, no cabin, nothing. Just land and trees and the kind of silence you only get when you're far from the road. That year, I finally got a week off from work, and I told myself it was time to get started on building the first structure. A small dry cabin. Nothing fancy, just a one-room shelter with a wood stove and a small deck. I planned to come back up on weekends, but for now, I'd spend a few days working alone. I packed up my pickup with tools, lumber, canned food, water jugs, a cot, and a tarp. I didn't bring a tent. I figured I'd get the frame and roof up by the second day, and I could sleep inside by then. It wasn't going to be insulated or finished, but it would keep me out of the weather. The drive up from Idaho was long and quiet, just how I like it. As I got closer to the property, the roads turned from paved to gravel, then gravel to dirt. The last stretch wasn't much of a road at all, just a trail with ruts and loose rock. I parked the truck about 30 yards in where it flattened out and got to work. It was cool out, maybe in the 40s and overcast. I could smell rain in the air, but the clouds were still high. I figured I had time. The first day went slow. The ground wasn't level where I wanted to build, so I had to dig out part of the hillside by hand. I didn't have a machine for that, just a spade and a pickaxe. I spent the first 6 hours digging and clearing and trying to square off the space. The trees were thick around me, mostly fir and pine. I cleared a few small ones and left the bigger ones. I liked the idea of the cabin being tucked into the trees. Felt private, quiet. By sundown, I had the base leveled, the post holes dug, and a few beams laid out. My hands were blistered even through my gloves, and my lower back was tight. I threw a tarp between 2 trees, set up my cot underneath, and cooked up some beans with a camp stove. That night, it rained lightly, just a mist coming through the trees. It wasn't much. I slept fine. The second day, I woke up early. The sky was gray again. I made coffee on the stove, ate a cold Pop-Tart, and got back to it. I worked until late afternoon and got the floor built and the wall frames up. I didn't have help, so raising each wall was a slow process. I'd nail braces to the bottom, prop them up with a ladder, and adjust one side at a time. There were moments where the wind would pick up and catch the frame just enough to make it wobble, and I'd freeze in place, afraid it might fall. But it held. By evening, I had all 4 walls standing and braced. No roof yet, just a square skeleton in the woods. The clouds looked darker now, heavy and low. I ate quickly and set up my cot inside the cabin frame, under a tarp I stretched across the top. It wasn't perfect, but I felt better sleeping inside those 4 walls, even if they were open to the wind. That night, the rain came heavier. Not a storm, just steady and wet. The tarp dripped in a few places, and I had to shift my sleeping bag to stay dry. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise outside, a branch snapping, not a small twig, something thick. I lay still, listening. Then I heard footsteps, not animal footsteps, human, slow, steady, squishing in the wet leaves. It came from the uphill side of the cabin, out past the trees I hadn't cleared. I held my breath. I had a hatchet under my sleeping bag. I kept it there out of habit. I didn't move, just stayed still, listening. The steps stopped near the edge of the frame, maybe 10 feet from where I lay. I couldn't see anything through the tarp and darkness, just the sound of water dripping and wind in the trees. I waited. After maybe a minute, the steps started again, moving off into the woods. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, I convinced myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe an elk. Something heavy-footed. Still, I kept the hatchet on my belt the whole next day. I didn't have a gun. I regretted that. Day 3 was colder. The rain came and went, sometimes just mist, sometimes full-on showers. I got the roof beams up, laid out the plywood, and started tacking down tar paper. I didn't have shingles yet, those would come later. The goal was just to keep the rain off. I worked fast. My hands were numb by the end of it, but I finished. I finally had a real roof and I was soaked, but I felt proud. That night, I slept inside the frame, dry and off the ground, on my cot. Felt good. The walls still had gaps, but the rain couldn't touch me. I sat for a while in the dark, listening to the forest. Then I heard that sound again. Footsteps. Same slow pace, same squish through the leaves. Closer this time. I sat up and grabbed the hatchet. I didn't make a sound. The steps circled the cabin. I heard them on the uphill side, then behind me, then downhill, then they stopped. I stayed still for a long time. At one point, I whispered out, but I got no reply, and I felt stupid for even doing that. There was no one to answer. Whoever or whatever it was, they didn't speak. They just walked and stopped and walked again. Eventually, the steps faded. I didn't sleep at all. The 4th day, I checked around the cabin first thing. I looked for prints, but the ground was too wet and torn up from my own boots. I couldn't tell if anyone had been there. Nothing looked disturbed. I kept working anyway. I closed up the walls with plywood and started framing the small deck out front. I could hear the river below the hill, maybe a quarter mile off. That sound kept me grounded.
Familiar.
Peaceful. By now I was tired. Not just sore, mentally tired. That kind of exhaustion you get when your nerves stay tight for too long. Every crack in the forest made me turn my head. Every bird call made me freeze. The wind in the trees started sounding like whispers. That night, the rain came hard. It slammed the roof and ran off the edge like a faucet. I had a small battery lantern inside, and I kept it on. I didn't want full darkness. Around 2 a.m., I heard something on the deck. A boot. I swear it was a boot. Stepped once, wood on wood, then again. I didn't move. There was no door yet, just an opening where one would be. I sat up slowly and held the hatchet tight. The light inside the cabin didn't shine far, but I saw a shadow, tall, unmoving, just outside the door frame. It didn't speak, didn't come in. It stood there for what felt like 10 minutes. Then it was gone. I didn't hear it walk away, just silence.
I steiet av vacke till dawn.
The next morning, I didn't want to move. I didn't want to go outside. I packed up slowly. I didn't finish the deck. I left the last of the plywood inside, gathered my tools, and walked to the truck with my head on a swivel. I didn't see anything in the trees.
No footprints.
Nothing moved, but I felt watched. I drove out that day, took the long road back. Every now and then I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be walking down the trail behind me. Back home, I tried not to think about it. I told myself it was probably a hunter, or maybe someone living off-grid nearby. Maybe I was on someone's land and didn't know it. But deep down, I knew something was off. 3 weeks later, I went back up with a friend from work, just to check on the cabin. We didn't stay long. The plywood I left inside was gone. Nothing else had been touched, just the plywood. We found a pile of wet clothes stuffed into a black garbage bag under the deck frame. Men's clothes, moldy, worn. My friend said nothing, but we both agreed we wouldn't sleep up there again until I built a real door. A lock, something. It's 2025 now, and I've finished the cabin. It's tight, insulated, and has a solid steel door. I still go up there sometimes, but I never go alone. Not anymore. And when it rains, I always stay awake a little longer, listening. I never saw the man's face, but I know he was real. I was 32 when I took a break from everything and stayed at that old farm cabin in Kansas. It was the fall of 2017, and I'd just gone through a bitter breakup and lost a job I'd given nearly a decade of my life to. I was burned out and my head was too loud. A friend of mine from college, Dan, had inherited a bunch of rural land from his uncle, and among the acres of wheat fields and overgrown pastures was a one-room log cabin that hadn't been touched in years. He offered to let me stay there for as long as I needed. I said yes without thinking twice. The land was about an hour west of Salina, Kansas, dry, flat, with barely any trees except some windbreaks by the house and barn. Dan didn't live there himself. He lived down in Texas and only came up once or twice a year to keep an eye on things. There were no neighbors nearby, just miles of farmland, dirt roads, and sky. I drove out in late October. The sun was warm during the day, but the nights had already started to get cold. The cabin sat near the edge of a dry field. No animals were being raised there anymore. The barn 100 feet behind it looked like it hadn't housed anything in years. The boards were warped from rain and heat. Half the roof was collapsed. It leaned a little to the left like an old man with bad hips. Still, something about it caught my attention more than the cabin did. The cabin was simple. One room with a bed, a wood stove, an old fridge that didn't work, and a table with 2 chairs. The windows were single-pane glass, no curtains. You could see clear across the field in every direction. It smelled like dry wood and mouse droppings. I had to clean out a few old nests from corners. There was no plumbing, just a rusted well pump outside that miraculously still worked, and an outhouse behind the barn. It felt like stepping 100 years into the past. The first couple days were fine. I chopped some firewood from a half-dead elm nearby and got the stove going. I slept better than I had in months. No cell service, no internet, no noise except the wind, coyotes, and the creaking of the cabin walls at night. It was what I needed, just me, the cold air, and quiet. But after 3 days, I started noticing things that made me feel watched. The first thing was the tracks. On the 4th morning, I stepped out early, before the sun had burned off the night chill. I was carrying a bucket to the well when I saw fresh boot prints in the dirt leading up to the cabin. Not mine. These were wider, heavier. The stride was different too. I double-checked my own prints to compare. The ones I saw didn't match my boots at all. They came up from behind the barn, curved around to the window by the bed, and then disappeared back toward the barn. No tire tracks, no horse prints, no indication of how the person got there. I thought maybe it was an old hunter or a squatter, maybe just someone passing through. But I didn't hear anything the night before. The leaves around the cabin were dry, and the sticks snapped loudly underfoot. I should have heard something, but it had been dead quiet. I walked around for half an hour, checking behind the barn and into the trees lining the field to the west. Nothing. I even shouted once or twice. No one answered. I told myself maybe the tracks were older than I thought. Maybe the wind had cleared the dust and made them look fresh. That night, I stayed up late by the stove, sipping warm beer and reading an old hunting magazine I found in the cabinet. Every time the stove popped or a mouse scratched inside the wall, I looked up. I slept badly that night. I kept waking up thinking I heard something. Footsteps, maybe, or the sound of someone breathing. But each time I sat up, it was just me and the dark room. The next day, I checked the area again. No new tracks. The ones from the day before were still there, but looked like they'd softened a bit in the wind. I started to feel better. Maybe it had been my imagination. That night, I fell asleep easier, but just before dawn, I woke up cold. Not because the fire was out, I'd kept it going, but because I felt something was wrong. The feeling that I wasn't alone was so strong, I sat up and grabbed the hatchet I kept beside the bed. I didn't hear anything at first. The cabin was quiet. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it, from the direction of the barn. A scraping sound, long and slow, like something heavy being dragged across dirt or gravel. It stopped. Then it came again. I stood there in the dark for maybe 10 minutes, not moving. The sound came again, drag, drag, then silence. When the sky started turning gray, I finally stepped out and walked toward the barn. There was nothing.
No footprints. No marks.
Nothing out of place except that the barn door, which I'd remembered as stuck shut from before, was slightly open. Just a few inches, like someone had pried it. I went back to the cabin, packed some of my things, and decided to drive into town to pick up a trail cam. I told myself I'd catch a raccoon or coyote on camera, just to calm my nerves. The nearest hardware store was 45 minutes away. I bought 2 cheap trail cameras and some canned food. When I got back that afternoon, I installed one facing the cabin door and one pointed at the barn entrance. That night, I kept the fire low and tried not to think. I read until I couldn't keep my eyes open. At some point during the night, I heard something again. Soft footsteps in the dirt. I didn't move. I waited, heart pounding. The sound stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. First thing in the morning, I checked the trail cams. The one facing the cabin caught nothing. The one at the barn? Dead batteries. They were brand new. I put them in myself. The timestamp on the last photo was from just a few minutes after I'd gone to bed. Then nothing. The batteries had died less than an hour after dark. I went to check the barn in daylight. The door was still open a crack. Inside, it was darker than I expected, and the roof had a big hole that let in pale sunlight. There were piles of broken wood, an old ladder, rusted tools, and something I didn't notice the first time. A hole in the floor at the far end, hidden under loose boards. It was about 4 feet across and looked like it had been dug out by hand a long time ago. Not a well, not a root cellar, just a hole, deep and black. I dropped a stone in and waited. Took a long time to hit anything. When it did, it sounded soft, like dirt or maybe old hay. I didn't like it. I left the barn door open after that. I wanted to see if it moved. That night, I slept with the hatchet on my chest and a flashlight in my hand. The wind picked up after midnight. The cabin creaked louder than usual. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I thought I heard something again. Footsteps outside, then something brushing against the wall. I stayed still. My breathing was the only sound I could hear. Then the cabin door creaked. Just a little. It didn't open, but I swear I heard it flex on the hinges. I didn't move. I stayed like that until sunrise. When I got up, I checked the trail cam again. The one by the cabin had captured something. Just one photo. A blurry figure standing by the barn, facing the camera. It looked like a man. Tall, with a thick coat, boots, and what looked like a cloth sack in one hand. His face was turned slightly away, caught in motion. The photo was taken just after 2:30 a.m. I looked at it for a long time. Then I threw the trail cam in the cabin and walked around the property again. Nothing. No sign of him, but there were new boot prints. He'd come up from the south this time, near the edge of the field, walked past the barn, stood there for a while, and then turned back. I didn't know if he'd seen the camera. I didn't know if he even knew I was there, but I had a bad feeling. The next day, I drove into town again. I tried to ask around without sounding crazy. I asked the guy at the hardware store if there were any squatters or known trespassers in the area. He just shrugged and said most folks stayed on their own land. He hadn't heard of anything. I bought a bigger flashlight, more batteries, and another lock for the cabin door. When I got back, I locked the door from the inside with both the latch and the new padlock I installed. That night, I didn't sleep. I just lay there waiting. At 3:12 a.m., I heard the footsteps again, coming closer. Then they stopped. I could hear the breathing, not mine, outside the cabin wall, shallow and slow. Then the window creaked, like someone pressing their hands against the glass. I held my breath. It didn't break, but I could feel him there. I didn't move until dawn. When I opened the door, there were fresh prints again, right up to the window, palm prints on the glass, and a dead rabbit on the step. His neck had been broken, laid carefully, almost neatly. That was it for me. I packed everything I could fit in the truck and left before the sun was fully up. I didn't look back at the barn or the hole or the woods. I drove straight until I hit Salina, then got on the interstate and didn't stop until I crossed into Colorado. I called Dan the next day and told him I'd left early. I didn't give him details. He said it was fine, that the land was probably going to be sold anyway. I didn't ask who else knew it was still there. It's been years now. I still have the trail cam photo. Sometimes I look at it. The man standing there, just barely caught in the motion blur. I still don't know who he was, but he knew I was there. He came back night after night. He never broke in. He never spoke, but he got closer each time. The last night, he was right at the window. Maybe if I'd stayed one more night, he would have come in. But I didn't, and I don't ever plan to go back. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided to take some time off. I'd been working 12-hour shifts as a building inspector in Boise, Idaho, and the pressure had been building for months. I wasn't eating well. I wasn't sleeping much. I needed to be alone. So I planned a trip to a remote cabin in the Kaibab National Forest in northern Arizona, about 30 miles south of Jacob Lake. A guy I used to work with, Travis, had a cousin who owned a small off-grid cabin out there. Said it was the perfect place to disappear for a while. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, just a few miles of dirt road, trees, and quiet. I'd brought everything I thought I'd need. Non-perishable food, propane, water containers, a folding cot, thick blankets, a solar battery pack for flashlights, and my portable stove. I even packed a rifle and a sidearm because the area was known for mountain lions. I wasn't a big hunter or anything, but I didn't want to be caught empty-handed. The cabin itself was older but solid. It sat at the edge of a thin clearing surrounded by dense pines and brush, about 100 yards from a dry creek bed. The place had one small bedroom, a main room with a table and an old iron stove, and a dusty little outhouse about 50 feet out back. There were some animal traps stored on the side of the porch, and a few rusted tools hanging from hooks along the wall. Whoever had lived there last hadn't been back in a while. Dust on every surface, dead insects in the windowsills, rat droppings in the corner of the pantry. I spent the first day cleaning and setting up. I fixed the door hinge, swept the floors, set my supplies in order. The first night was uneventful. Cold air seeped through the window gaps, and I could hear the wind whisper through the trees. I was used to noise back in Boise, sirens, cars, late night shouting from the neighbors. Here, the silence was almost too heavy. It sat on your shoulders. By the second night, I'd begun to relax. I spent most of the day hiking around the area, taking mental notes of the terrain. The hills around the cabin were covered in thick woods, and I came across old animal tracks in the dirt, mostly elk and deer. I even saw some scat that looked like it could be coyote. I kept my rifle slung over my shoulder just in case. That night, I cooked some rice and canned chili on the little stove and sat on the porch in the dark, listening. There was a moment I remember clearly, around 10 o'clock, when I heard something in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a coyote howl, but it had a strange echo to it. It dragged too long and ended abruptly, like someone trying to mimic a howl and not doing a very good job. But I didn't think too much of it. Just weird animal sounds in the dark. It wasn't until the third day that things started to feel wrong. I woke up just after dawn and went outside to relieve myself. As I walked around the side of the cabin, I saw something in the dirt. Footprints. Human ones. But they were barefoot. The toes were long and thin, and they pointed inward slightly, like the feet were pigeon-toed. I knelt down and looked closer. The prints led up from the tree line to the side of the cabin, then doubled back. There were no shoe marks, just those long, flat feet. It had rained slightly during the night, and the tracks were fresh, probably no more than a few hours old. I immediately circled the cabin, rifle in hand, but didn't see anyone. No movement in the woods.
No noise.
Just that cold wind and the sound of pine needles brushing against themselves. I spent the rest of the day trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone had been camping nearby and wandered through. Maybe some crazy hermit was living out here. It was public land after all, and I wasn't the only one who knew how to find solitude out here. But something about those prints stuck with me. They were too clean, too straight, like the person had been walking directly toward the cabin with a purpose. That night, I barely slept. I kept the rifle on my lap as I sat inside with the lantern turned down low. I didn't hear anything for hours. The wind died down around midnight, and the forest fell into this thick, complete silence. Not even an owl. And then, maybe around 2 in the morning, I heard movement. Not loud. Just a soft crunching in the leaves, off to the left side of the cabin. Then a twig snapped. Then nothing. I didn't go out to look. I just sat there, heart racing, every muscle stiff. I waited until the sky began to lighten. The next morning, I found more prints. Same feet, same direction. This time, they led all the way up to the front porch and stopped right at the door. There was a faint smudge on the handle, like someone with dirty hands had touched it. Not enough to open the door, just a single grip. That changed everything. I packed my gear into the truck and drove 30 miles to the nearest ranger station. It took an hour and a half to get there because of the dirt road. When I arrived, I asked if anyone had reported vagrants or strange activity in the area. The ranger was a short guy with a beard and a faded green jacket. He looked through a folder and shook his head. No reports. Nothing weird. He said most people didn't come that deep into the forest during the fall, especially with elk season coming up. I debated leaving. I really did. I even got as far as the gas station back near Fredonia. But something pulled me back. I told myself it was paranoia, just cabin fever, that I needed to finish the week I'd planned and not let one weird event ruin it. So I went back. I shouldn't have. The 5th day, I didn't leave the cabin at all. I kept the rifle loaded and near my side. I only stepped out briefly to collect some water and relieve myself. I kept the fire low. I made coffee and tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Every sound outside put me on edge. Around sunset, I heard rustling near the creek bed. I stayed low, cracked the window, and listened. I couldn't see anything through the trees. Then I heard a sharp, low whistle, like someone calling a dog. One single note, then silence. No one should have been out there. I waited for hours. Nothing followed. I slept in 2-hour intervals, waking up to scan the windows and check the door. By now, I had nailed a wooden plank across the front entrance and used an old chair to wedge it shut from the inside. On the 6th day, I saw them. It was early morning. The fog hadn't lifted yet, and the whole forest looked like it was covered in smoke. I stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, and looked out toward the tree line. That's when I saw something move behind the trees. Not a deer, not a bear. It was a man, or at least I think it was. He stood partially behind a tree, only half visible, just inside the mist. No clothes that I could see. His skin was pale, ashy. He didn't move like a normal person. His body twitched slightly, like he couldn't stand still. His arms hung too low, and his shoulders jutted forward like he'd dislocated them. His head was tilted to the side, almost too far to be natural. He didn't make a sound, just stared. I raised the rifle, shouted, even though I told myself I wouldn't speak. He didn't flinch. He just slowly moved behind the tree and disappeared into the fog. I fired one shot into the air, then backed into the cabin and locked the door. My breathing was ragged. I could feel my hands trembling. That image, his face or lack of one, I wasn't sure, stayed with me. I didn't sleep that night. On the 7th day, I planned to leave. I woke early and stuffed my pack. But when I got to my truck, I found something that nearly made me puke. The tires had been slashed. All 4, deep cuts, not with a knife, looked like claws, or something jagged like torn metal. There were long scratches along the side of the truck bed, and a chunk of raw meat, what looked like animal flesh, was stuffed into the wheel well. Blood had dripped down the side panel overnight. I locked myself inside the cabin and stayed there until nightfall, waiting, watching. Every now and then I'd see movement in the distance, a flash of skin, a shape darting between trees. They weren't trying to hide. They wanted me to see. That night, I set up my final plan. I had one flare. I tied my pack tight, loaded the rifle with my last rounds, and waited until the first signs of morning. Then I left the cabin on foot, heading northeast toward the service road, hoping I'd find someone. I hiked for 6 hours before I finally heard the hum of an engine. A hunter in a beat-up Chevy stopped and picked me up. He asked if I was okay. I didn't answer, couldn't. I just pointed toward the forest behind me. By the time I got to the nearest sheriff's office, I gave them everything I could remember, descriptions, tracks, what I saw. They filed a report. That was it. No one investigated the cabin. No one went back to check the tracks. I never found out who or what was out there, but I know it wasn't an animal. It wasn't some ghost story. It was a person or people trying to act like something else, twisting themselves into something broken, watching, waiting, trying to get in. That cabin was torn down the following spring after a Forest Service sweep found it had no proper permits. The guy who owned it didn't contest it, said it was time. I never went back, and I won't. It was early October 2016 when I drove up to a cabin in Northumberland for what I thought would be a quiet break. I had just turned 34 a week before and wanted time away from people, traffic, work, and all the noise that seems to grow heavier every year. I worked in Manchester in construction planning and barely took holidays. When I did, I wanted nothing but stillness and space. A friend of mine had told me about this small, old cabin he rented once deep in the Kielder Forest area. He said it was basic but had heat, power, a wood stove, and privacy. I booked it for 4 nights. It was a 4-hour drive, and the last 30 miles were mostly winding, empty roads through dense forest. I lost phone signal halfway there and didn't get it back the rest of the trip. The place was as remote as it gets. The cabin wasn't in a holiday park or on a farm, but sat alone in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine and spruce trees. A rough gravel track led to it, and the only sign that someone had been around recently were faint tire marks in the mud that looked weeks old. The structure itself was old, with greenish-brown wooden walls that had gone soft with age. The windows were thick glass, small and dusty. There was one main room with a wood burner, an old couch, and a small kitchen. A short hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom with weak plumbing. The water ran, but the pressure was low, and it smelled a bit metallic. Still, it was enough. I brought food, a big backpack of clothes, and some books. I unpacked, lit a fire, and by sundown the whole place was warm and peaceful. That first night, I didn't feel anything strange. I read for a bit, made a simple dinner, and listened to the quiet outside. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and wind moving through the trees. I remember sitting in the wooden chair by the window, staring out into the blackness. No stars were visible, and even though I knew the trees were just a few meters away, I couldn't see them. It was like the forest swallowed every bit of light. I felt alone, but in a calm, welcomed way. I went to bed early and slept well. The second day, I hiked for hours. There were trails nearby, some marked and others not. I wandered along a small river, climbed a ridge, and even saw a herd of deer in the distance. I didn't see another person or building the whole time. That isolation was what I had come for. I got back to the cabin around 5 p.m., muddy and tired, and made some eggs and toast. After a hot shower, I felt like I had settled into the place properly. It was that second night when things shifted a little. I was sitting outside on the front step with a coat wrapped around me, watching the trees sway. The air was sharp, but I liked how still everything was. As I was about to head back inside, I thought I saw something move between the trees to my left. It was quick, just a flicker of motion, like someone had stepped behind one of the wider trunks. I stared hard but saw nothing else. I waited a minute longer, then told myself it was a deer or even just the wind messing with branches. I went inside and locked the door, which I hadn't done the night before. Later that night, I woke up around 2:30 a.m. needing the toilet. I got up, used the bathroom, and washed my hands. While drying them, I looked into the mirror and noticed the smallest sound, just a creak, almost like the weight of a foot on old wooden planks. I froze. The cabin did make noise sometimes, settling or cooling off from the day's heat, but this felt different. It was too soft to be wind, too slow to be a falling branch. I walked slowly to the front window and peeked out through the narrow glass. Nothing, just darkness and my own reflection. I waited a minute, then climbed back into bed, but I didn't fall asleep for a long time. The third morning felt heavy. I don't mean the air or the weather, just the mood. The inside of the cabin felt colder even though the fire was going. I noticed that one of the logs from the pile outside had rolled away from the stack. I didn't remember it being like that, but I also wasn't sure. I picked it up and brought it inside anyway. I spent most of that day inside reading and writing in a notebook. I didn't feel like hiking again. I thought about heading back early, but it felt silly. I had 2 nights left, and it wasn't like anything had actually happened. I chalked it up to being alone in a quiet place. Silence can mess with your head after all the city noise. It wasn't until that night that I saw her. It was late, around 11 p.m. I was in bed, not quite asleep, when I heard a tap, very soft. I thought maybe something fell in the kitchen. Then it came again.
Top.
Pause, then tap.
Top.
It was coming from the window beside the bed. I sat up slowly, heart already racing. The curtains were closed. I held my breath and listened. Another pause, then one more single tap. I got out of bed, moved slowly to the side of the window, and gently pulled the curtain open just a crack. At first, I saw nothing but blackness. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw the faint shape of a face. Pale, unmoving, barely lit by the faint moonlight that had broken through the clouds. The face was thin, the hair messy and long, and the eyes were wide open. She wasn't moving, just standing inches from the glass, staring into the window. I let go of the curtain and stepped back. My chest was tight, my breath caught. I didn't move for maybe a full minute. When I finally looked again, she was gone. Nothing but trees and dark. I stood there for a long time. I didn't know what to do. I checked the lock on the front door, then the back. Both were solid. I turned off all the lights and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, facing the front of the cabin, listening for any sound. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went outside the cabin and looked around. My boots were wet from the dew on the grass, but I forced myself to walk the perimeter. I found prints in the soft dirt below the bedroom window. bare feet. The prints were thin and narrow. The ground had kept them clearly. They came from the tree line, stood beneath the window, and then turned back toward the forest. I packed up most of my things, threw them in the boot of the car, and debated driving out. But something in me didn't want to leave in a panic. I kept telling myself it was probably some local messing around. Maybe a lost hiker. Maybe someone just off their meds. I hated that thought, but it was better than thinking she was dangerous. I decided I'd stay one last night, but I kept the axe for splitting firewood close, and I didn't open the blinds at all that evening. Around 6 p.m., I heard something in the woods. Not directly near the cabin, but not far either. Crunching steps. Deliberate. I looked out from the front window in the main room. Nothing. But the noise didn't stop. Circled, slow and steady. It sounded like someone was walking around the cabin's outer edge, taking their time. I waited. The steps paused. Then I heard them behind the cabin. Then silence. The quiet after was almost worse. I stayed near the window until it was completely dark. No more steps. I tried to eat something, but I couldn't get it down. I didn't go to bed. I sat in the living room with all the lights off, only the fire still going. I didn't want to move or draw attention. I kept that axe close, my back to the wall, my eyes on the front door. It was about 2 a.m. when I heard the sound again. This time it wasn't tapping. It was scratching, the slow kind like fingernails against wood. I held my breath. It was coming from the front door. Scratch, scratch, then nothing, then again scratch. I didn't go to the door. I didn't open the curtain. I just sat there, frozen. After a few minutes, the scratching stopped. Then heavy silence again. When light finally started to creep in around 6 a.m., I opened the curtain and looked out. Nothing was there. No sign of her. But when I opened the front door, I saw 3 long marks down the center of it. They were narrow and shallow, like fingernails had dragged along it over and over. That was it for me. I didn't even bother cleaning up. I threw the last of my stuff in the car, locked the cabin, and drove away without breakfast. The gravel cracked under my tires like it was cheering for me. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't stop until I hit the first main road and saw another car pass me going the other way. I didn't report it. I didn't tell anyone for weeks. What would I even say? I don't know who she was. I don't know what she wanted. I just know she was real and she was there. No ghost, no hallucination. Just a woman in the woods who watched me, waited, and came back. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I had opened that window. If I had left the door unlocked. If I had fallen asleep again. I never rented a cabin after that. I never will. I still have nightmares sometimes, not of her face exactly, but of those long, slow taps at the window in the middle of nowhere. I was 34 when it happened. This was back in the summer of 2016. I had taken some time off from work, burnout mostly. I was working in a construction planning office in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and had been juggling deadlines and budget meetings for months without any real break. My doctor said I needed time alone, away from the noise, something quiet to reset. So I rented a small cabin out in northern Arkansas, about 40 minutes outside of a town called Harrison. The listing said it was once used as a hunting lodge in the 1980s, now refurbished for weekend escapes. It was backed up against a wooded ridge behind an old limestone quarry that had been abandoned years ago. The place was cheap, almost too cheap, but I liked the look of it. Just a single-floor wooden cabin with a wraparound porch, a little fire pit in the front, and thick woods stretching out behind it. No neighbors, no traffic. I was told by the owner that there was no cell reception out there, but the place had power, running water from a well, and gas for cooking. That was enough for me. I drove up on a Thursday afternoon. It was warm, not blistering hot like back home, and the air smelled cleaner. The drive had been mostly smooth, but the last couple miles were all narrow gravel road with long curves and sharp turns. I had to slow to almost a crawl in some spots. By the time I pulled into the clearing and saw the cabin, the sun was already beginning to lower past the trees, throwing long shadows across the gravel. The cabin looked even smaller in person, but it was clean. The windows were clear, the door looked newly painted, and the wood siding had a kind of sun-faded charm to it. I unpacked slowly, just one duffel bag, a cooler with food, a hunting knife I brought just for peace of mind, and a few books. The porch had a rocking chair, and that's where I sat for the first hour, watching the trees and listening to the breeze. I went to bed early that night. I didn't even eat dinner, just drank a bottle of water and fell asleep to the hum of crickets and frogs outside the screened window. The first full day was peaceful. I woke up at sunrise, made some eggs on the little propane stove, and then hiked around the nearby woods. The trees out there were dense, with thick underbrush and scattered limestone rocks that stuck up like old bones. I came across what looked like an old game trail about half a mile from the cabin and followed it for a bit. There were broken branches and dry leaves, but nothing alarming. A few times I spotted deer tracks, but they looked old. When I got back to the cabin, I found a strange thing sitting on the porch railing. It was a rock, just a small piece of smooth, gray limestone. At first, I figured maybe I had kicked it earlier and it landed there, but that didn't make much sense. It was sitting too neatly, right in the middle of the wooden railing, balanced like someone had placed it there on purpose. I didn't think much of it, just tossed it back into the woods and went inside. That night, I cooked some beans and sausage, read a few chapters from a novel, and went to bed a little after dark. I slept okay, but woke up at some point during the night. It was dead silent. No crickets, no wind, just stillness. I don't know what woke me. Maybe a dream, maybe nothing. I lay there, listening, waiting for something to break the silence. After a few minutes, I drifted back off. The next morning, there was another rock, this time on the step leading to the porch. Same size, same color. I felt a little weird, but told myself it could be animals. Maybe raccoons had dragged it up. Maybe wind, though there hadn't been any wind. I walked around the cabin slowly, checked behind it, even scanned the tree line. There wasn't anything or anyone. The woods looked like they always did, still and dense. I pushed the weird feeling down and tried to get on with my day. But I didn't hike that day. I stayed close to the cabin, cleaning it up a bit, organizing the little shelves, res-tacking some firewood, just keeping my hands busy. By that night, the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like the stillness had weight to it. I kept the porch light on even though it was just a single bulb that barely lit the railing. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see something standing out there. Nothing ever was. Then around midnight, I heard a sound. It was faint, but it was definitely footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, like someone walking in boots. The sound stopped just below my window, near the side of the cabin. I froze in bed, heart thudding. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting. After a while, the footsteps didn't come back. There was no knock, no voice, no light, just nothing. I eventually got out of bed, slowly, and looked out the window through a gap in the curtain. But I couldn't see anything, just the yard lit faintly by the moon. The next morning, I found boot prints in the gravel. They came in from the road, circled around the side of the cabin, then went back the way they came. They weren't mine. The tread was different. Vida Deepa. Someone had come up to the cabin in the night. I felt a tightness in my chest. I couldn't call anyone. No signal. No internet. I thought about leaving, but something in me didn't want to let this place chase me away. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stupidity. I don't know. I decided to stay just one more night, but I brought the hunting knife to bed with me. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me sit up. I thought I heard movement outside again, maybe once or twice, but nothing loud. Then, just before dawn, I dozed off. When I woke up, the front door was cracked open. I know I locked it the night before. I remember checking it twice. My bag was still there. Nothing was missing, but there was something left inside. Another rock. This one was sitting on the kitchen counter. Same size, same shape. That's when I knew I had to leave. I packed my things as fast as I could. Barely ate, didn't even change clothes. I got in the car and started down the gravel road, but about a mile from the cabin, I saw something in the middle of the path. It was a small pile of rocks, 5 or 6 of them, stacked one on top of the other. It was like a marker. I got out, kicked them aside, and drove through. My hands were sweating so bad I could barely grip the wheel. When I got back to town, I called the sheriff's office and reported what happened. I told them someone had been coming around the cabin at night, leaving things, possibly entered it. They sent someone out, but a few days later I got a call saying they didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no boot prints, no piles of rocks. Just an empty cabin. I didn't go back. I didn't ask for a refund. I just wanted to forget about it. But sometimes when I'm alone, especially at night, I think about the person who walked around that cabin, about the rocks, and about how quiet the woods had become. Not silent from nature, but silent like something was watching and waiting. I moved out of Oklahoma the next year, started fresh in Colorado. I still hike, still camp, but I don't go to remote places alone anymore. And I always check the ground around my tent or cabin, because if I see even one rock where it doesn't belong, I'm leaving right away. I'm Jordan, 29 years old, and I work as a freelance photographer. In late October of 2023, I decided to take a short solo trip to a remote part of northern Vermont to capture some autumn scenery before the leaves fully dropped. The idea was simple: find a quiet spot away from the crowds, set up my camera, and spend a couple of days alone with nature. I didn't plan for anything scary or weird, just a peaceful weekend in the woods. But what happened still sticks with me. I drove up early Friday morning, leaving the city behind and following a narrow 2-lane highway that wound through dense forests and small towns that looked like they'd barely changed in 50 years. The further north I went, the quieter the road became. Eventually, the pavement gave way to a gravel track that led deeper into the woods. My GPS showed a small dot labeled Bear Creek Cabin, an old, abandoned place I had read about in a local blog dedicated to forgotten spots. The blog had a few photos of the cabin's weathered exterior and said it was near a shallow creek running through the forest. When I arrived, the sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin was exactly as described: small, rough, and clearly unused for a long time. It leaned slightly to one side, the wood warped and darkened by years of weather. The windows were either missing or covered in grime, making it impossible to see inside from the outside. The roof sagged, and some shingles had fallen away, exposing the wooden beams beneath. Despite the state of decay, the place still held a strange charm. It felt like a frozen piece of history in the middle of the wilderness. I parked my car beside the old dirt road and grabbed my backpack and camera gear. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and pine. I took a few photos of the cabin from different angles, trying to capture the way the light hit the weathered wood. Then I decided to explore inside. The door was partially ajar, hanging crooked on rusty hinges. Creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dark, smelling of mold, wood rot, and something else: stale, old dust mixed with damp earth. The floorboards were uneven and covered with a thin layer of dirt and leaves that had blown in through broken windows. The interior was small, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a stone fireplace on one wall and a few broken pieces of furniture scattered around. I turned on my flashlight and looked around carefully. The fireplace was cold and empty, but the ashes inside suggested it had been used not too long ago. Old newspapers, yellowed and torn, lay scattered on the floor. Most were from the late 1970s, but a few dated back to the early 2000s. There were some rusted cans and glass bottles near the corner, likely left by someone who had stayed here briefly at some point. As I moved deeper inside, my boots stirred up dust that floated in the beam of my flashlight. I noticed scratches on the wooden walls, some deep and jagged, others faint. I touched the wood, feeling the rough grain under my fingertips, imagining the hands that had built this place decades ago. I thought about the people who had lived or stayed here, maybe hunters, loggers, or just folks wanting a quiet hideout. After a while, I set up my tripod and camera near the window to catch the fading light filtering through the broken glass. The forest outside was turning dark, and the temperature dropped quickly. I hadn't expected how cold it would get once the sun went down. I sat on the floor near the fireplace, unpacking my small stove and some food. The plan was to stay overnight, so I had packed some essentials: a sleeping bag, extra clothes, a first aid kit, and a small supply of canned food and water. I started to heat some water for coffee and tried to relax. The silence was deep here, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird calls. As darkness fully settled, I lit a small lantern and placed it on the floor. The cabin's walls seemed to close in, shadows stretching and twisting. The wooden floor groaned beneath me now and then, as if settling, or maybe stirred by some unseen animal outside. I didn't feel afraid, exactly, but the atmosphere was heavy and strange. Later, when I was ready to sleep, I laid out my sleeping bag near the fireplace and zipped myself in. I kept the lantern low but still glowing. Outside, the wind picked up and made the trees sway, their branches tapping against the cabin's walls like quiet knocks. I listened, alert but telling myself it was normal forest sounds. At some point in the night, I woke up abruptly. The lantern had gone out, smothered by a sudden gust of air that came through the cracked window. The cabin was plunged into near darkness, save for a faint silver glow from the moon outside. My heart beat faster as I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling in the cold air. Then I heard it, a noise, soft but clear, coming from just beyond the cabin wall. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a raccoon, or a deer brushing past the trees. But the sound was different, like slow, deliberate footsteps on dry leaves, crunching and dragging. I froze, listening. The steps stopped near the side of the cabin, where the old wood was rotten and cracked. For a moment, everything was silent except my own breathing. Then, a faint scraping sound started. Something was rubbing or scratching against the wood, slow and steady. I wanted to call out, but no words came. My mind raced, thinking about what it could be. A hunter? A lost hiker? Someone else camping nearby? But no other vehicles or lights were visible. And if it were an animal, why would it make that strange scraping noise? I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the window. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the trees just outside. Nothing moved. I moved slowly to the door, ready to open it, but stopped. What if whoever was there wasn't friendly? What if it was someone looking for trouble? The sound stopped suddenly, replaced by silence that felt even louder. I sat back down, keeping the flashlight close and waiting. Time passed, each minute stretching longer than the last. The wind outside seemed to die down, and the forest grew unnervingly still. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped my sleeping bag and stood up, feeling stiff and cold. The sky outside was pale and gray, clouds thickening with the promise of rain. I decided I wasn't going to stay another night. Before leaving, I took one last look around the cabin. The scratches on the walls caught my eye again. This time, I saw they weren't random. They looked like letters, initials maybe, carved deep into the wood over time. Some looked fresh, with sharper edges and lighter color. I wondered if someone had been here recently, maybe not long before me. As I walked back to my car, the gravel crunching underfoot, I kept looking over my shoulder. The forest felt less peaceful now, heavy with the unknown. I didn't tell anyone about the noises or the scratches. It seemed pointless. Who would believe me? And maybe it was nothing, just the forest playing tricks on my mind. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear those slow, scraping sounds, as if something or someone was watching just outside that old cabin. I left Vermont a few hours later, heading back to the city. The photos I took turned out well, but I never went back to that cabin or anywhere near Bear Creek again. The experience stuck with me, a quiet reminder that some places, no matter how peaceful they seem, hold secrets best left alone. I wasn't planning to ever go back to the cabin. Not after everything that happened between me and Ava. We had bought that place when we were still trying to make it work, back in 2011 before the divorce. It was just over the Idaho border, nestled in the pines east of Grangeville, near a barely named stream that barely showed up on the maps. We called it ours, even though it always felt like hers. After the divorce in 2017, I never saw it again. She kept the place in the settlement. I didn't argue. I didn't want to. Then Ava died last fall. A car wreck near Spokane. I wasn't invited to the funeral. Her sister informed me over email, flat and businesslike. "You should know," she wrote. That was it. A few weeks later, a lawyer contacted me. Apparently, she had never updated her will. The cabin came back to me, just like that. I ignored it at first, let the letter sit on my kitchen counter until I couldn't look at it anymore. Then one cold weekend in early November, I packed up my truck and drove north. I told myself it would just be a quick visit. See the place, maybe clean it up a little, make sure it wasn't falling apart. Maybe list it for sale in the spring. I had no reason to stay longer than a day or two. The drive up was long and gray. Clouds hung low and heavy. The two-lane road winding through the pines felt even more remote than I remembered. The last 20 miles were gravel and potholes, with barely any cell reception. The truck shuddered as I climbed the last hill, and there it was, still standing, tucked between trees like it had been waiting. It was just like I remembered it. A simple one-story structure, pine siding darkened with weather, the tin roof streaked with rust, and the porch steps slightly warped. There was moss on the edges of the deck. The small glass window in the front door still had the sticker I put there 12 years ago. It was a faded outline of a trout. I don't even fish. The air was cold and still. No snow yet, but the smell of it was in the wind. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was exactly how we had left it, like some frozen snapshot. The old couch, the tiny wood stove, the scratched-up kitchen table with a chair missing a leg. The picture frame of the Selway River still hung crooked above the stone fireplace. I stood there for a long time, not moving, listening to the quiet press in around me. Everything smelled faintly of mildew and dust, but it wasn't as bad as I expected. I turned on the faucet in the kitchen, dry. I found the breaker panel and flipped the switches. The power kicked in barely. One of the overhead bulbs flickered weakly. The other didn't turn on at all. The well pump groaned once and sputtered to life. After a few moments, water started to flow, thin and yellow for a minute, then clear. I dropped my bag in the back bedroom and walked the perimeter outside. No signs of animals getting in. A couple of squirrels had nested in the eaves. The shed out back was still locked. I had the key on a ring I hadn't touched in years. Inside were some old tools, a plastic canoe with a hole in the side, and a rusted gas can. By the time I got back inside, the wind had picked up. Dried pine needles rattled across the roof. I got a small fire going in the wood stove using the chopped logs still stacked beside it. Most were half rotted. The warmth spread slow, but steady. I made myself a cup of coffee with water from the well and a camping stove I'd brought. I sat at the table, drinking in the silence. The first night was quiet. I barely slept. My thoughts kept drifting, looping back to Ava. Her laugh, her temper, the fights, the way she'd sit in this exact room, barefoot and wrapped in an old flannel blanket, reading by the window. I felt like I could still see her if I turned fast enough. The second day, I started cleaning, took out old food containers, wiped down every surface, found a dead mouse under the sink, bagged up whatever clothes she had left behind and stuffed them in garbage bags. I paused when I found her notebook on the nightstand. She used to write little things in it, grocery lists, quotes, sometimes things she was too scared to say out loud. I didn't open it. I placed it back gently. That afternoon, I hiked the ridge behind the cabin. The trees were bare and stiff. I followed an old deer trail to the top, where the view opened up. I could see miles of forest stretching out in every direction. Smoke curled from my chimney. It felt like I was the only person for 20 miles. Coming back down, I noticed something odd. Footprints, not mine. Fresh ones, pressed into a patch of soft earth near the edge of the trail. They looked recent, too big to be Ava's old ones, too narrow to be mine. My chest tightened. I followed them for a few yards, but they disappeared into dry leaves. Back at the cabin, I checked the doors and windows. Locked. Nothing seemed disturbed. Still, I slept uneasy that night. I thought I heard something around 2 a.m., a sharp crunch of branches. I got up and looked out the window. Nothing, just trees swaying in the wind. The third morning, I found the porch door unlatched. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I walked the property again, saw nothing out of place, but my nerves were tight. I told myself it was animals, maybe a raccoon, maybe I just forgot, but I didn't believe that. I loaded up more trash bags into the truck. I didn't want to stay another night. I was starting to feel watched, like the woods had eyes. I decided to check the shed again before leaving. It hadn't felt right the first time I went in. The back corner was darker than the rest, the wood damp from a small leak in the roof. I moved some crates and froze. In the corner, wedged between the wall and an overturned lawn chair, was a sleeping bag. A recent one, blue synthetic with a tear at the seam. Beside it, an empty can of beans, a plastic fork, and a half-burned candle. Someone had been staying here. I backed out of the shed, heart pounding. I scanned the treeline. Nothing moved, but my gut screamed. I went inside the cabin, locked the doors, pulled the blinds. I sat there for hours, gripping a heavy flashlight like a weapon. Just before dusk, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, deliberate. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I didn't move. I sat in the dark. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't say anything. I just heard the footsteps fade, one by one, back into the trees. I didn't sleep that night, just waited. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. At first light, I packed everything, got in the truck, and drove. Didn't look back. Didn't stop until I hit a gas station near Lewiston. When I told the county sheriff later that week, he barely raised an eyebrow. People live in those woods, he said. Sometimes they pick cabins when they're empty. I asked him if they'd investigate. He said he'd send someone up there. I never followed up. I sold the cabin that spring. Whoever had been staying there probably moved on. Or maybe they're still out there. Either way, I didn't want to know. Sometimes, I still see Ava in my dreams. Sometimes she's there in the cabin, looking out the window, and sometimes she turns to me and smiles like she used to, back when we were still trying. But then I remember the footsteps, and that strange silence that settled in just before dark. I'll never go back to that place again. Not because of ghosts, not because of memories, because sometimes people are scarier than anything your mind can make up. And some places, no matter how familiar, are better left alone. I was 34 when it happened, and even now, almost 3 years later, I still think about it every time I hear branches snap outside my window. My name's Matt, and I live in North Carolina. Back in the fall of 2022, I decided to take a week off from everything. Work, my phone, people, and head into the woods with my dog, Toby. Toby was a 5-year-old golden retriever with way more energy than I ever had. Loyal, obedient, always by my side. I figured if I was going to unplug for a while and just breathe, he was the best company I could ask for. I found a rental cabin up in the western part of the state, near the edge of the Nantahala National Forest. It wasn't fancy or big, just a one-room wooden structure with a wood stove, a narrow bed, a small kitchenette, and a screened-in porch. No Wi-Fi, no cell reception, no distractions. I'd been dealing with a lot that year. Burnout, a breakup, and the feeling that time was moving way too fast. I didn't go out there expecting anything crazy. I just wanted quiet, maybe hike a bit, maybe read some old paperback books I brought along. I figured I'd fish, cook over the fire, and just relax. But that trip changed how I see things. I don't camp alone anymore. The first 2 days were perfect. Crisp air, leaves starting to turn red and gold. Long walks with Toby through the trails behind the cabin. We'd get up early, make coffee, and head out for hours, only turning back when the sun dipped low behind the trees. I kept my .38 in my backpack, not because I expected trouble, but because it felt like the smart thing to do. You never know when you'll run into a bear or something worse. I barely thought about it. On the third night, things started to feel off. We'd gone for a hike that afternoon deeper into the forest than I had before. Toby was on alert the whole time, stopping now and then, ears twitching, eyes focused ahead. He didn't bark, but he kept looking at the same direction, northwest, up into a thicker part of the woods where the trees grew tighter together and the light barely got through. I chalked it up to maybe deer or another hiker, even though we hadn't seen a single person since we'd arrived. When we got back to the cabin around sunset, I fed Toby and made myself a simple dinner: beans, sausage, and some rice I cooked over the stove. I ate out on the porch. It was peaceful, quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that almost has a sound of its own. Toby didn't eat much that night, which was weird. He kept pacing near the door, sniffing the air, tail stiff. I opened the door a few times, thinking he needed to pee, but he wouldn't go far from the steps. Eventually, I brought him in and locked the door behind us. I pushed a chair under the knob too, just in case. That cabin was old and the door latch didn't feel all that secure. I lay in bed that night with Toby curled up by my feet. I'd left the window cracked for fresh air, but sometime past midnight, I woke up to the sound of crunching leaves outside. Slow, steady steps. Not an animal. You can tell the difference when you've been in the woods enough. Animals are fast or erratic. These steps were slow, measured, human. I didn't move. I just listened. Toby sat up, ears perked.
No growling, no barking.
Just quiet alertness. That was more worrying than if he had barked. His eyes were locked on the window. The footsteps circled the cabin. One full lap, then they stopped. I didn't hear anything for a minute, maybe more. Then a tap on the wall. Just one. Not loud, like a knuckle. Then silence again. I stayed completely still for what felt like forever. I didn't even reach for the gun in my backpack. My breathing was shallow, my heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there might hear it. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. My body gave in to exhaustion. Next morning, I searched the perimeter.
No prints.
The ground was covered in thick leaves. I tried to tell myself it had been an animal, maybe even a tree branch falling. But I knew better. Toby sniffed around too, but didn't find anything. Still, he stuck closer to me than usual that day. That afternoon, I debated whether to leave early. I had 4 more days booked, but the idea of spending another night there didn't sit right. I walked down the road toward where I parked my truck, about a quarter mile from the cabin, down a steep hill. It was hidden behind some tall pines and partially covered by a tarp I'd brought. When I got there, everything looked untouched. I popped the hood and checked underneath just to be safe. Nothing strange. I stood there for a while thinking, should I leave? Was I overreacting? I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anything concrete. I decided to stay one more night, and if anything else weird happened, I'd pack up and leave at first light. That night, I didn't sleep. Toby kept growling low in his throat, never barking, never moving far from the door. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, this time lighter, faster, not circling, approaching. Then a scratch on the door. Not claws, fingernails, just 2 long drags across the wood. I grabbed the gun this time, sat up in bed with it on my lap. I didn't speak. I didn't move toward the window. Toby was standing now, body stiff, staring at the door. Then the sound stopped. Nothing after that. Not a sound. I sat there until the sky began to lighten. At dawn, I opened the door with the gun in my hand. I walked around the cabin. No sign of anyone. But I found something else. 2 deep scratch marks down the wooden door, about chest height, like someone had dragged a knife or a sharp rock. Not enough to break through, but fresh. That was it for me. I packed everything, loaded the truck. I didn't even eat. I wanted to get out of there before the sun got any higher. It took me a while to calm Toby down enough to get him in the back seat. He kept looking over his shoulder toward the trees. When I drove down the narrow dirt road back to the main highway, I checked the rearview mirror constantly. Never saw anyone. No cars. No movement. But the feeling in my gut didn't go away for a long time. Back home, I didn't talk about it for a while. I told people the trip was fine, quiet, nothing much to report. But for weeks afterward, I'd wake up at 2 or 3 a.m., heart racing, thinking I heard that sound again. Fingernails across wood. About a month later, I called the guy who rented me the cabin. He lived a couple hours away, older man, didn't really use email much. I asked him, casually, if anything weird had ever happened up there. He hesitated, said once in a while hikers had gone missing nearby, but the area was big and easy to get lost in. He didn't say much more. A few weeks after that, I saw a news article. A hiker, woman in her 20s, had vanished in that same forest. Her car was found near a trailhead not far from where I'd stayed. No sign of her. That sealed it for me. I've gone camping since then, but never alone, and never without checking the area thoroughly. Toby's older now, not as quick, but he still gets that alert look when something's off. I trust it. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but it was real. Not a ghost, not some fairy tale creature, just a person with bad intentions. Someone who knew I was alone. Someone who didn't knock to say hello, but scratched. That cabin's still up there. I saw it listed again last year on a short-term rental site. Same pictures, same porch. I wondered if anyone else ever felt watched there. I never went back to find out. The air was colder than I expected for early October in Vermont. I pulled my jacket tighter, the wind slicing through the trees like a knife, the leaves rustling with a dry, brittle sound. I had been driving for hours that afternoon, winding my way through narrow, twisting roads surrounded by dense pine forests. I wasn't from around here. I'd only been to Vermont once before, a few years back on a summer trip, but this time I came with a purpose, to get away from the city, from the noise and the stress, and to spend a few days alone at a cabin I'd rented. The cabin was old, built in the late 70s, tucked deep into the woods near a small town called Stowe. It was one of those places you'd drive past a dozen times without noticing. A weathered wooden structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch, sitting at the end of a dirt road that disappeared into the trees. I'd found it online, rented it for a few nights, hoping to escape into silence and solitude. No cell service, no internet, just me and the forest. I parked my car on the gravel driveway, the tires crunching underfoot, and stepped out. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The sky was a cold, pale blue, streaked with thin clouds. The smell of pine and wet earth filled my nose, sharp and fresh. I grabbed my backpack and walked up the porch steps, the wood creaking beneath my weight. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, damp wood, and faintly of mothballs. It hadn't been used much lately. The furniture was sparse. A small wooden table, a couple of folding chairs, a rusted metal stove in the corner. The windows were grimy, letting in weak, fading light. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. No electricity, just as the listing said. I wasn't surprised. I was prepared with flashlights and candles. I set my bag down and took a deep breath. The silence was overwhelming, almost heavy. No cars, no voices, just the faint creaking of the cabin settling and the distant sound of wind through the trees. I liked that about the place. It was peaceful in a way you don't find in the city. I went out back to check the surroundings before dark. The forest behind the cabin was thick and shadowy. I could see deer tracks in the dirt, broken twigs, and a few scattered pine cones. I heard a bird call somewhere far away, a sharp, quick sound. The air was chilly, making my breath visible as I exhaled. After a while, I went back inside, lit a candle, and unpacked a bit. I had brought some canned food, a thermos of coffee, and a book to read. I was planning to spend the night here, then hike the nearby trails during the day. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The unfamiliar sounds of the forest, the rustling branches, the distant howl of a coyote, the scratching of something small outside, kept me awake. I lay on the thin mattress, listening and trying to calm my thoughts. The next morning, I woke early. The pale dawn filtered through the dirty windows. I made coffee on the old stove using the little propane canister I had brought. Outside, the forest was wet from overnight rain, the ground muddy and soft. The smell of wet leaves and earth was stronger now. I decided to explore the area around the cabin before heading to the trail. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight and headed down a faint path leading from the cabin into the woods. The path was narrow and overgrown in parts, but I pushed through, enjoying the quiet. The trees stood tall and close, their trunks covered in moss and lichen. After walking for about 20 minutes, the trail opened into a small clearing. In the center was an old, dilapidated shed, the wood blackened by years of weather, its door hanging loosely on rusted hinges. I was curious and went closer, shining my flashlight inside. It was mostly empty except for some broken tools and a pile of old, rotten wood. I turned back towards the cabin, deciding to come back later for my hike. Later that afternoon, as the sun lowered again, I was back at the cabin. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees noisily. I was about to start dinner when I noticed something odd out the back window. Near the edge of the forest, not far from the clearing with the shed, I saw a shape, something pale lying on the ground. Curiosity pushed me outside again, this time with more caution. I grabbed my flashlight and moved quietly toward the clearing. The closer I got, the clearer it became. It was a person, or at least what was left of one. I stopped, frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. The body was sprawled face down on the wet leaves, pale and bloated, with dirt and leaves stuck to the skin. The clothes were torn and dirty. I recognized no one. There was no sign of movement. The smell hit me before I even saw the face. A sickly, sour stench that made my stomach twist. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but there was no signal. The cabin's isolation meant no cell service. I tried again, hoping for a single bar. Nothing. Panic and fear crept in. I realized I had to find help the old-fashioned way. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. I pulled out my map, a physical one I had brought along, and figured the best way was to walk back to the main road and find a town or a phone. But first, I needed to examine the body more closely. I had to be sure this was no accident. The position of the body suggested it had been there a while, maybe days or weeks. The skin was grayish, with patches of insects crawling over it. The clothes were ripped, but there were no obvious signs of trauma like cuts or blood. It looked like the person had died from exposure or illness. I took out my jacket and laid it over the body as a sign of respect. Then, I turned and started walking back towards the cabin, my mind racing. Once inside, I locked the door and sat down, trying to think clearly. I wrote down everything I'd seen, hoping it might help me explain later. I packed my bag quickly, water, food, flashlight, map, and prepared for a long walk. The sun was setting fast now. I left the cabin with a heavy heart, stepping carefully through the wet forest. The darkness fell quickly, and soon I was using my flashlight to navigate. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless. I followed the dirt roads, the path becoming rocky and uneven. My legs ached, and my breath came in short gasps. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw the faint glow of headlights on a distant road. Relief washed over me. I approached the road cautiously and flagged down a passing car. The driver, a middle-aged woman, listened carefully when I explained the situation. She called the police for me. When the authorities arrived, I guided them back to the cabin. They examined the body carefully, taking photos and notes. Later, I learned that the man was a local who had been reported missing weeks ago. He had been living rough in the woods, trying to survive on his own, but hadn't made it. The police thanked me for reporting it. They told me that in such remote places, it wasn't uncommon for people to disappear quietly, but it was rare to find them like that. I stayed for one more night in the cabin, but the silence felt different, heavier, burdened by what I had found. I packed up the next morning and left, the weight of the forest and that forgotten man lingering in my mind. Driving away, I glanced back once more. The cabin disappeared among the trees, quiet and empty, holding its secrets tightly. It was late October of 2019 when I took the seasonal ranger job out near Catoosa Wildlife Management Area in eastern Oklahoma. I was 34 at the time, single, and between more permanent positions. I had been working odd jobs in nearby towns for months and wanted something that would get me away from people for a while. The ranger gig was temporary, just a 3-month post to help out through the late hunting season. It paid just enough and came with a small log cabin near the north edge of the forest. The idea of peace and quiet in the woods appealed to me more than it probably should have. The cabin was about 8 miles in from the main highway and sat at the end of a narrow gravel road that wound up a low ridge. It was just one room with a separate outhouse, a wood-burning stove, and a propane tank for cooking. No cell signal out there. A shortwave radio was the only way to talk to the station down south, which I checked in with twice a day, once at 6 a.m. and again at 9 p.m. Other than that, I was expected to patrol the surrounding area, monitor any signs of poaching or illegal camping, and make sure the hunters were sticking to regulations. Most days I'd wake up around 5, stoke the stove back to life, and head out on foot or take the ATV if I planned to check the farther trails. There was something deeply satisfying about walking those frost-covered woods in the early morning. The world felt still and clean. You could hear everything: the smallest rustle, the distant call of crows, even the echo of your own footsteps across the dry leaves. For the first few weeks, it was everything I wanted. Some hunters came through and stayed in designated zones, but they didn't bother me. I checked their tags, warned them about open fire rules, and went back to my solitude. Occasionally, I'd come across some trash or signs of people off trail, but it never seemed serious, just locals poking around the edge of the reserve. I logged it, cleaned it up, and moved on. But toward the end of November, things started to change. The first thing I noticed was a cut fence on the eastern boundary of the management area. It was a simple wire fence that marked where private farmland gave way to public land. Someone had used wire cutters and snipped clean through 3 sections, folding it back just wide enough for a truck or ATV to pass through. I fixed it up with some spare wire I carried in the ranger shed and made a note in the report book. I figured it was just kids or hunters trying to save a few miles of walking. Then, about a week later, I found a dead deer hanging from a tree about 5 miles northeast of the cabin. At first, I assumed a hunter had field dressed it and left it hanging overnight, though that's not common. But when I looked closer, the cuts didn't look clean. The skin had been torn in jagged lines, not sliced, and the hindquarters were hacked in a rough, messy way like someone had used a dull blade or was in a rush. The oddest part was that the organs were gone, but the meat had mostly been left behind. It didn't make sense. Whoever killed it wasn't after the meat. Maybe it was for the trophy, but there was no head either. I noted it, took some pictures with the small digital camera they gave us, and marked the location on my paper map. The radio wasn't working well that night, static on every frequency, so I waited until morning to call it in. The following weekend, I saw tire tracks on a service road that's supposed to be locked off. It runs west of the cabin through a remote part of the woods that's closed to the public due to past landslides. The padlock on the gate had been cut clean off. The tracks led in about 2 miles and then veered off into the trees. I parked my ATV and followed them on foot. After about 20 minutes of slow hiking, I came across a small clearing where someone had made a rough camp. Just a ring of stones for a fire pit and a few beer cans scattered around. The embers were still warm. Whoever it was had left within the last few hours. I didn't see anything that explained the dead deer, but I started to feel uneasy. Something wasn't right out there. These weren't just careless hunters or teenagers. The remoteness of the spot, the fresh signs, the cut lock, it felt deliberate. That night back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see any lights, but I kept waking up, listening. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I looked through the window, there was nothing. Just frost on the ground and the faint glint of moonlight on the trees. I started locking the cabin door at night, even though there was no real point. The door was just old pine with a simple bolt. If someone wanted in, they'd get in. I also started leaving the oil lamp on low overnight. A few days later, on one of my longer patrols, I found something that really shook me. About 6 miles northwest, near a bend in a dry creek, there was an old hunting blind up in a tree. It wasn't part of the official structures we maintained. It looked like something someone had built years ago and forgotten. I almost walked past it until I caught the glint of something metallic reflecting in the sun. I climbed up slowly, the wood creaking under my boots. Inside, there were 3 things: a pair of old binoculars, a rusted thermos, and a journal. The journal was water-damaged but readable. Most of the entries were from early 2018, from someone named E.L. No full name. The writing was messy, but legible. The early pages talked about game trails and tracking patterns. But as I flipped through, the tone changed. By mid-entries, it was full of rants about being watched and strangers moving at night. One sentence was circled several times. They come in pairs. One always watches. Another page had just 2 words written over and over. Don't sleep. I packed the journal and brought it back to the cabin. I didn't know whether to laugh it off or take it seriously. Some paranoid hunter with a little too much isolation. Maybe, but it added up in the wrong way with the things I'd seen: the deer, the tire tracks, the campfire. The last straw came in early December. I was returning from a 2-day loop checking backcountry cameras when I saw smoke in the trees about half a mile from the cabin. I stopped the ATV and moved in on foot, slow and quiet. The smoke was coming from a small lean-to made of pine branches and a blue tarp. It wasn't there 2 days before. I watched from a distance for several minutes. No movement, but I saw a bundle of bones next to the fire pit. Some kind of small animal that had been roasted over the coals. There was also a plastic bag half buried in the dirt behind the shelter. I moved in and pulled it out with my gloves. Inside were more bones, blood-stained rags, and a large hunting knife. The blade was old, but sharp, and had what looked like homemade carvings on the handle. Triangles, lines, not letters, just markings. I left everything in place, went back to the cabin, and called it in on the shortwave. They sent 2 officers up the next morning. We hiked back to the lean-to, but it was gone. The fire pit was cold and stomped out.
No bag. No bones.
Even the blue tarp was missing. All that was left were boot prints and 1 chicken bone half buried in the ash. The officers took my statement, looked over the area, and told me to keep my eyes open. They didn't seem particularly concerned, but I could tell they didn't like it either. After that, I didn't sleep right for the rest of the job. I heard things at night, branches cracking underfoot, rustling near the cabin, the occasional thump against the walls. I never saw anyone, never caught a clear glimpse, but I started keeping the shotgun nearby and slept in my clothes, boots on, ready. On my final night in the cabin, the wind was high. I had just finished packing my bags and planned to head out early. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath and didn't move. Then a low creak, the floorboard just outside the door. I waited for a knock. Nothing came. I finally leaned forward and looked through the corner of the window. Just trees. Just blackness. At first light, I loaded up the ATV and got the hell out of there. Didn't stop. Didn't eat. Just rode straight to the main station. When I turned in the keys, I didn't look back. They offered to extend my post. Said they could use someone with a calm head during the winter months. I told them no thanks. To this day, I don't know who was out there. Could have been illegal hunters. Could have been some off-grid folks living in the brush. Or something else. Something worse, but still human. What scared me most wasn't the things I saw. It was the feeling that someone was always watching. Always just out of sight. Always close. I still go into the woods. Still hike and camp when I can. But I never do it alone anymore. And I never ignore that feeling when something seems wrong. Out there, the silence doesn't mean safety. It just means you haven't been found yet. I was 27 when I finally went back to my grandma's old cabin. It sat deep in the woods near Mill Creek, a small town in northern Wisconsin, where my grandma, Ruth, had lived for most of her life. She passed away 2 years earlier in 2021, and I hadn't been back since the funeral. I used to visit her every summer when I was a kid, but after she got sick, I stopped coming. This time, I was alone and didn't plan to stay long. Just a weekend, maybe 2 days, to sort out some things and close that chapter for good. The road to the cabin was rough. Narrow dirt, full of ruts and loose stones, twisting through thick pine trees. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked almost the same as I remembered. Weathered wood, faded green paint peeling off in places, a stone chimney on one side. The windows were dark, some cracked. A few rusty old tools hung on the porch. The smell of pine and wet earth hit me right away, mixed with a faint mustiness that told me no one had been here in a while. I parked the car at the end of the driveway and got out. It was late afternoon, the sun low and weak behind thick clouds. A chill ran through the air. I had brought a small backpack with a few things: a flashlight, some canned food, water, a blanket, and a journal. No internet, no phone signal. Just me and the cabin. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old wood smell. A few rays of light spilled through the windows, landing on a rough wooden floor covered in dirt and leaves. The cabin was small, just one main room with a kitchen corner, a small wood stove, and a door that led to a tiny bedroom and bathroom. I switched on my flashlight and walked inside slowly. I noticed the old furniture still there: a rickety table, 2 chairs, a faded quilt folded on the bed. On the kitchen counter, there was an old coffee pot, a couple of rusty cans, and a stack of yellowed newspapers from months ago. The place felt frozen in time. My plan was simple: stay the night, sort through some boxes, and leave early the next day. But after I set up my sleeping spot in the bedroom, I decided to explore the land around the cabin before dark. I walked past the porch, stepping carefully on the loose wooden boards, then followed a narrow trail that led downhill to Mill Creek itself. The creek wasn't much, just a thin ribbon of water cutting through the dense forest. The sound of flowing water was quiet but steady. I crouched by the edge and watched a few small fish swim in the shallow pools. The air was cool and fresh here, but I noticed something odd. A few broken branches, some footprints in the soft mud. Not animal tracks, at least not entirely. The prints looked like human boots, maybe recent, but they headed deeper into the forest. I stood up and looked around. The trees were thick, casting long shadows in the fading light. The forest was dense here, the kind of place where you could easily lose your way. I didn't like the feeling that someone might have been nearby, but I told myself it was probably just hunters or locals. As I headed back toward the cabin, the sun dipped lower. A gray fog began creeping between the trees, swallowing the path behind me. By the time I reached the porch, it was nearly dark. I locked the door behind me and pulled the curtains closed, hoping to feel safer inside. That night, the cabin felt colder than I expected. The thin walls let in every creak and rustle of the forest. The wind moaned softly, shaking the window panes. I kept the flashlight close and made sure the door was locked tight. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard something more deliberate. A crunching step on dry leaves, slow and heavy. I froze. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I lay still, listening. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, moving slowly around the cabin. I didn't dare open the door or look out the window. Instead, I grabbed my phone to check the time and signal, but as I expected, there was none. No way to call anyone. I thought about leaving, but the darkness outside and the forest all around made it seem dangerous. The sounds circled the cabin for nearly an hour. Sometimes footsteps, sometimes the snapping of twigs, and once I thought I heard a soft whisper, but that might have been my imagination. I stayed awake the whole time, barely breathing, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. The sun filtered weakly through the trees, and the forest was silent again. I opened the door carefully and stepped outside, scanning the area. On the porch, I found something that hadn't been there before. A small, crudely made pile of rocks and sticks. It looked like some kind of marker, but I couldn't tell why it was there or who put it. I felt a shiver run down my spine but kept my composure. I decided to pack quickly and leave the cabin behind for good. As I gathered my things, I noticed the footprints I saw the day before were still around, but now they formed a clear path leading toward the main road, not deeper into the forest. I followed the trail to see where it ended. The path was rough and overgrown but easy to follow. After about 20 minutes, I reached an old, abandoned hunting shack. It looked like no one had been here in years. Boarded windows, broken door, a rusted sign hanging loosely from one hinge. I searched around the shack and found some old cans of food, a discarded lighter, and an empty bottle. Then I noticed something more troubling. A fresh pile of clothes and a worn-out backpack near the shack's side. Someone had been living here recently, maybe hiding out. A cold feeling settled in my gut. The footprints I'd seen weren't just from a hunter or local. They belonged to someone who might still be nearby. I felt exposed and uneasy, alone in the middle of the forest with no way to contact anyone. I hurried back to the car, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I reached the road, I finally got a faint phone signal. I called a friend to tell them where I was and that I was heading back to town. My hands trembled as I started the car and drove away, watching the woods disappear behind me. Later that day, I learned from the local sheriff's office that they'd been searching for a missing person for weeks, a man believed to be living somewhere in those woods. They asked me questions about the cabin and the shack, and I told them everything I saw. They told me to be careful if I ever returned, and that the area was under surveillance now. The feeling of unease stayed with me for days, but I was glad I had gone back. Closing that chapter wasn't easy, but I left knowing the cabin was just an old house in the woods. No ghosts, no fantasies, just real dangers hidden in the forest silence. In the end, the cabin wasn't scary because of the past or some ghost story. It was scary because of what might still be out there, hidden, watching, and that was enough for me to never go back alone. I never planned to stay in that cabin for more than a weekend. It was early October 1997, and I was 27 years old. I had taken a few days off work, wanting a break from my cramped apartment in Denver, Colorado. The city was tiring, the noise, the people rushing by without looking up. I needed quiet. I wanted to breathe fresh air, see some trees, hear the wind without the constant hum of traffic. I had rented a small cabin near Flathead Lake, Montana. The owner was a man named Tom who managed a few properties out there. The place was about an hour outside Kalispell, nestled deep in the woods where the forest grew thick and the roads were just dirt paths. No internet, no cell phone signal, just me and nature. I figured it would be peaceful, and maybe I'd do some hiking, read a book, and just get away from it all. The drive from Denver was long, but I didn't mind. The highway stretched out ahead of me like a ribbon. I remember passing the plains, then the foothills, and finally the pine forests as I climbed into the Rockies. The air got cooler the higher I went. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The cabin was simple, wood walls darkened by age, a stone chimney on one side, a small porch with a creaky rocking chair. The door had a rusty metal latch and a faded welcome mat. Inside, it smelled like pine and wood smoke. There was a small living room with a couch, a wood stove, a tiny kitchen with an old gas stove, and a bedroom with a creaky bed. The windows looked out onto the forest, tall pines stretching into the sky. I unpacked my bag, set my things down, and went outside. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees. I could hear the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional chirp of a bird. There was a gravel path leading down toward the lake, but it was hidden behind a thick wall of brush. That first night, I built a fire in the stove, lit some candles, and made myself a cup of instant coffee. The cabin was cold. The heater was just a small electric unit that barely worked. I wrapped myself in a thick blanket, sat on the couch, and stared at the flickering flames in the stove. Outside, the wind picked up. It sounded like it was moving through the trees like a living thing, a low, moaning whistle. I liked that sound. It was the kind of noise that made you feel alive, reminded you that you were just a small part of a much bigger world. I went to bed early, tired from the drive. The mattress was firm, the blankets rough but warm enough. Outside the window, the wind pushed branches against the glass, tapping and scratching. It was natural, nothing to be scared of. I told myself that over and over. I didn't expect to hear footsteps outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind knocking branches against the walls. But the sounds were too deliberate. Crunch, crunch, crunch on the gravel porch. A soft thud against the door. Then silence. I froze, heart pounding. I didn't have a phone to call anyone, and I was miles from the nearest house. I grabbed the old flashlight I had brought and quietly got out of bed. The cabin was dark except for the dim glow from the stove. I tiptoed to the window and peered outside. Nothing, just the thick trees swaying in the wind, shadows shifting between trunks. No sign of anyone. I checked the locks on the door. The latch was still secure. Maybe an animal, deer or a raccoon, but the steps sounded heavier, like a human. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just the imagination. The woods could play tricks on you, especially alone at night. The wind made strange noises, and the mind filled in the blanks. The next day, I planned a hike. I put on my boots, grabbed my backpack with water and snacks, and took the trail along the lake. The sun was bright and warm. The trees looked friendly in daylight, golden aspens and thick evergreens. I walked for hours, feeling lighter, happier. The lake was clear and cold. I dipped my hand in, watching the ripples spread out. On the way back, I noticed something odd. The path near the cabin had fresh footprints. Big, heavy boots, size way larger than mine. They led right up to the cabin door, then stopped. No prints leading away. My stomach sank. I checked the perimeter of the cabin. Nothing out of place. No broken branches. No marks on the door or windows. Just the footprints in the dirt and gravel. The wind was picking up again, making the trees creak. That evening, I stayed close to the fire stove. I kept the flashlight and a knife on the table beside me. I felt on edge but tried to stay calm. The footsteps returned, louder this time, crunching around the cabin, circling, pausing at the back door. I could hear breathing, heavy, uneven, not animal. Someone was out there. I didn't open the door or make any noise.
He sat frozen, listening.
The sound stopped after a while. The forest was still again. I told myself I would leave in the morning. I barely slept. The night was full of every small noise magnified. The crackling wood stove, the tapping branches, the distant howl of a coyote. I lay awake, heart hammering. In the morning, I packed everything quickly. As I was about to leave, I saw something near the edge of the woods. A small pile of sticks arranged oddly, like a crude marker. I had no idea what it meant. I got into my car and started the engine. The gravel road out was bumpy, but I drove fast, never looking back. The forest seemed darker as I left, the trees closing behind me like a door. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I told my friends the story, the footsteps, the silence, the marker, but no one believed me. They said maybe it was a hunter or a local playing a prank. Maybe I was just jumpy from being alone. Months later, I read in the local papers about a man who had gone missing near Flathead Lake. A hunter. His boots matched the footprints I found. They never found him. The police thought he got lost or fell. no foul play, but I never forgot those nights in the cabin. The way the footsteps circled, the heavy breathing just outside the door, the feeling of eyes watching through the trees. I don't go near that part of Montana anymore. I didn't expect it to get so cold that October weekend in northern Minnesota. The plan was simple: get away from the city for a few days, clear my head, and spend some quiet time in the woods near Lake Vermillion. I've been working nonstop for months and felt drained. My job in Minneapolis was demanding, and the constant noise of the city was wearing me down. So I packed my gear and drove up Friday afternoon, the sun dipping low in the sky as I passed dense pine forests and narrow, winding roads. The cabin itself was a small, weathered one tucked away on a ridge overlooking the lake. It belonged to my uncle's old friend, who let me use it while he was out of town. No electricity, no internet, just a wood stove, a bed, and a small kitchen. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a fishing magazine. All rustic charm, but with a deep sense of quiet loneliness. Exactly what I wanted. Pulling up to the dirt driveway, I noticed the gravel crunch under my tires, the only sound in the still air. The forest around was dense and silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the sharp cry of a hawk somewhere overhead. The trees, mostly spruce and pine, were dressed in early autumn colors, but there was a chill in the wind that promised winter wasn't far off. I grabbed my bags and locked the car. The cabin door creaked open, and the faint smell of wood smoke mixed with damp earth welcomed me inside. Dust coated the windows, and cobwebs clung to the corners, but everything seemed in order. I stacked some firewood near the stove and opened the small cooler I'd brought with food and water. The plan was to stay 3 nights. No phones, no distractions, just silence and the forest. That first night, the fire crackled warmly, and the cabin felt cozy despite the cold outside. I made a simple dinner of canned chili warmed over the stove and sipped lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, bending the branches and tossing dry leaves across the porch. I was tired but content. The kind of tired that sinks into your bones and makes you appreciate quiet. I set an alarm for early the next morning to hike down to the lake, then crawled under the threadbare blankets. Sleep came quickly, but it was restless. I woke at odd times, hearing noises outside, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, distant animal calls. The woods here were alive in a way the city never was. I reminded myself it was normal. Raccoons, deer, maybe a coyote or two. Nothing to be afraid of. Morning light spilled through the curtains, casting long, soft shadows. The air inside the cabin was cold, the fire long dead. I dressed in layers, thermal shirt, heavy jacket, boots, and packed a small backpack with water, a map, and some snacks. The sky was gray and overcast, the kind of day that felt like the world was holding its breath. The hike down to the lake was steeper than I remembered. The trail was narrow and covered in wet leaves, making each step slippery. My boots squelched in the damp earth as I moved carefully. Around me, the forest was quiet except for the occasional drip of water falling from branches. When I reached the lake's edge, the water was still and cold, the surface reflecting the gray sky like a sheet of glass. A few fishing boats lay moored near a rickety dock, bobbing gently. The smell of wet pine needles and moss was strong. I sat on a large rock, watching the water, letting the quiet wash over me. After a while, I headed back up to the cabin. The air was colder now, the wind sharper. I decided to get a fire going again. The wood was dry enough, and soon the room filled with warm orange light and the comforting crackle of flames. That afternoon, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a narrow dirt road nearby, but it looked rarely traveled. The forest was thick, with fallen logs covered in moss and mushrooms. I saw fresh tracks, probably deer, but also noticed something else. Faint tire marks in the mud, too recent to be old. It unsettled me a little, but I told myself it was probably a local hunter or camper passing through. I wasn't worried yet. I took note of the direction they led, away from the cabin and deeper into the woods. By nightfall, the wind had picked up, rattling the cabin's wooden shutters. I sat by the fire, reading a book by flashlight. The silence outside was complete now, broken only by the occasional gust that shook the trees and sent a shiver down my spine. At some point, I heard a faint noise, footsteps, maybe just outside the cabin. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. The noise stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox. But the sound was different, too deliberate, too heavy. I checked the windows. They were closed tight. The door was locked. Still, a feeling of unease settled over me. The second day was colder. A gray mist hung low in the forest, and a fine drizzle fell steadily. I stayed inside most of the morning, keeping the fire alive and eating canned soup. In the afternoon, I went outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. Near the back, I spotted footprints in the mud. They were human, size unknown, but fresh. They led away from the cabin toward the woods. I felt a tight knot in my stomach. Someone had been here, close to the cabin. I thought about leaving, calling it off, but my phone had no signal, and I didn't want to drive back in the rain. Besides, I told myself whoever it was had left. Maybe a lost hiker or another camper. That night, I barely slept. The cabin felt colder, darker. Every noise sounded louder. I kept the fire burning as long as I could, then wrapped myself in the blankets, listening to the wind howl outside. Around midnight, a sharp knock came at the door. I sat bolt upright, heart racing. I told myself it couldn't be. Who would be out here in the middle of the night, knocking on an empty cabin? The knocking came again, louder and more urgent. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the door. Peering through the window, I saw nothing. The porch was empty, but the shadows seemed to move. I wanted to shout, to scare whoever it was away, but my voice caught in my throat. The knocking stopped. Morning never came soon enough. I didn't sleep again, instead watching the cabin's windows, clutching a hunting knife I kept in my backpack. My hands trembled. Around dawn, I heard a vehicle engine outside, gravel crunching under tires. Relief flooded me. Someone was here, maybe a hunter or a ranger. I rushed outside to see a dusty pickup parked near the road. A man stepped out, looking worn but friendly. I explained my situation, and he offered to drive me back to town. On the drive back, he told me about recent reports of break-ins and robberies near the forest. Groups of people had been sneaking into cabins while owners were away, stealing supplies and sometimes worse. He said it wasn't safe to stay alone in places like that anymore. I listened, heart pounding. I realized how lucky I'd been to survive the night. Back in the city, the noise was overwhelming, but I felt a strange peace. I had faced real fear, real danger, and come out alive. The cabin trip was supposed to be a break from everything. Instead, it was a lesson. Nature is beautiful, but it can also hide dangers not from monsters or ghosts, but from people. And sometimes, the scariest thing is knowing someone else is watching you, waiting for the right moment. I never went back to that cabin.